Hey everyone, welcome to another special edition of Why Should I Trust You? Today we're joined by Kelly Ryerson. Many of you know her as the Glyphosate Girl. Kelly is an influential voice inside the MAHA grassroots movement, mobilizing action against what she believes are dangerous pesticides, which she feels need to be regulated in order to protect lives. And right now, the stakes couldn't be higher. The Supreme Court has just taken up a pivotal case that could limit Americans' ability to sue pesticide makers. Congress is debating language that could serve as an immunity shield for these companies, and a major study claiming glyphosate is safe has just been retracted. And then there are all these battles within the world of environmental toxins and toxic exposure. We'll discuss with Kelly whether this wing of MAHA, the one battling environmental hazards, is gaining real ground or is stuck. Can they work with the Trump administration and this EPA? Or on this front, the environmental one, is this alliance proving to be really mismatched? There's a lot going on, so let's get started. Hey, welcome everyone.
Yeah, welcome.
It is a special episode. We had to drop this on a Tuesday because that's just how we roll these
It was just
days.
that good.
It was just that good. We're just, we get some banging guest ideas and then the schedules just all line up so that we don't want to sit on them for too long. It is just Tom and me again for this one.
That's right. Mark and Maggie will be back next episode. And as always, reminder, send us notes to whyshoulditrustyou.net. And check out our Substack page. We
are so happy to have the chance to talk with such an important voice inside the MAHA movement, an influential voice amongst grassroots supporters especially. We've spoken a lot about how within the MAHA movement, there are several large sort of interconnected streams. And what do we mean when we say that, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, there's the food crew.
Yeah.
Right? There's the vaccine crew. And then there's environmental toxin crew. And obviously they're interrelated, but they're different agendas, different leaders, different voices, that all kind of feed into MAHA. And today, obviously, we're looking at the environmental toxins, team in that chapter of MAHA and what's going on here, because there's a lot going on here.
And that leads us to Kelly Ryerson. In a moment, we will meet Kelly. But first, I'm Brenda Adhikari.
And I'm Tom Johnson, and we're both journalists. And Mark and Maggie, as we said, will be back next time.
Okay, so today, Kelly Ryerson, as we said, she goes by the Glyphosate Girl online on social media, and she is pretty busy right now because a lot of critical things are occurring in terms of, the world of environmental exposures and hazards. And we talked about immunity shields for pesticide makers in Congress, the Supreme Court, which has just agreed to take up a case on that, while some foundational science on our understanding of the safety of glyphosate has just been retracted. So suffice it to say, the timing of having Kelly join us today could not be more fortuitous. But before we get to Kelly, Tom, help us get our heads around what's going on right now.
Yeah, so let's just talk some basics. So Kelly earned her BA in economics from Dartmouth. She got her MBA from Stanford Business School with a focus on healthcare public management. And then she completed a training in integrative health coaching at Duke Integrative Medicine. But she said it was through coping with her own chronic illness and her own health struggles that brought her to the topics of agriculture and how it impacts health. And she writes, quote, "I work at the intersection of agriculture and health, regularly collaborating with farmers, scientists, policymakers, and media to address agrochemical damage to our soil and bodies." So today, that journey has taken her in powerfully influential directions. Glyphosate Girl, as we talked about on social media, she has built a large mobilized following. She's, created a site called Glyphosate Facts. So that brings us to what is glyphosate. So in short, it's an active ingredient in herbicides. And the biggie is the product Roundup, which is the top selling herbicide in the world. And that was originally made by Monsanto. It's now owned by Bayer. And hundreds of millions of pounds of pesticides and herbicides are used each year in the U.S., and glyphosates make up a big portion of that. And of course, American farmers today rely on pesticides and herbicides as a key underpinning of modern agriculture. And as we mentioned at the top, this is a pivotal moment right now for glyphosate, which means it's a pivotal moment for Ryerson. The Supreme Court just agreed at the end of last week, just agreed to hear a major case involving glyphosate and its maker Bayer. So the EPA has said that glyphosate, when used as directed, does not pose a cancer risk for humans and therefore does not require a cancer warning on its label. But in several states, juries have reviewed the evidence and concluded that users should have been warned, holding the company liable under these failure to warn laws, which many states have, and held them accountable for billions of dollars. And it's important to note that while the EPA, like many other regulators worldwide, don't consider glyphosate a cause of cancer in humans when used as directed, there are several studies that have suggested a possible link. In 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified glyphosate as, quote, probably carcinogenic to humans. So it's an ongoing debate.
Yeah. And, Tom, on that, we had Michael Grunwald on our show, a few months ago when we had that group of farmers and MAHA supporters. And you're absolutely right that it's this conversation. It's a fault line. Glyphosate is yet another fault line that sort of brings together folks from the MAHA movement and then folks who believe that science is being sort of misused. And Michael cites, for his article, he cited both the EPA as well as other international bodies that I think in his article, if you give me 1 second, he said something like, noted that glyphosate has significantly lower acute and chronic toxicity than many other herbicides on the market. And so, it can be, as a consumer, I know that I get really confused when I look at all this contradictory reporting. And I hope we get into some of that today with Kelly.
For sure. And I think what she's also going to talk a lot about is this case in front of the Supreme Court. Because if the Supreme Court rules that the EPA's position supersedes state law, it really could limit what individuals could sue pesticide makers for. And we're talking thousands of cases. And what's interesting also, as we kind of explore the relationship between this wing of MAHA and the Trump administration, the Trump administration has already sided with the company's position and urged the Supreme Court to make the EPA standard the nationwide benchmark, I guess you could call it. While interestingly, the Biden administration on a very similar case took the opposite stance that's more aligned with MAHA's position today. So while that's playing out now in the court, a similar fight has been unfolding in Congress. And lawmakers recently stripped language from a House spending bill that would have given pesticide manufacturers legal protections. It's often called like a liability shield, this language that was in this bill. MAHA activists like Ryerson lobbied hard against it, and they found some allies with Democrats while dividing Republicans. So the issue is not over. So even though that so-called liability shield was stripped out, similar language might pop up in future legislation. And then finally, as we mentioned, in December, a scientific journal retracted a decades-old study that had long been cited in arguments that glyphosate does not pose risk to human health when used as directed. So they retracted that study. And it wasn't because there was new science, but rather that evidence emerged of corporate involvement in the research. So they could not stand by this research anymore.
Yeah, Tom, that retraction was kind of insane. I was reading the articles about it, and basically it turns out that the company's scientists were majorly influential in the study itself that was letting glyphosate off the hook. And then the company was high-fiving each other that they were able to get this through. Talk about mistrust and conflict of interest.
There's a lot of mistrust here. I mean, you could sort of see these subjects of corporate influence. Is the government going to rein in corporate influence or allow it to kind of go unfettered? And I will note, I read a statement by Bayer this fall that said, quote, it stands behind the safety of our glyphosate-based products, which have been tested extensively, approved by regulators, and used around the globe for 50 years. Pivoting now to just the EPA more broadly, because that's a very interesting topic. Critics argue that the Trump administration's EPA, which is led by Lee Zeldin, has moved to roll back or weaken rules on air pollution and drinking water, and it's now considering revisiting the EPA's longstanding endangerment finding. So that's a finding by the EPA that was based on years of its own research and outside of the agency's research that greenhouse gases pose a threat to public health. And that became the legal foundation for regulation of major carbon emitters such as cars and power plants. And just recently, two former EPA heads wrote, quote, will the EPA protect the environment and the health of Americans, or will it walk away from the very purpose for which it exists? So that is yet another cliffhanger facing this portion of MAHA right now.
Okay, well, we have a lot to get into with Kelly Ryerson. She's going to join us in just a moment. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back, and a big Why Should I Trust You welcome to Kelly Ryerson. Like we said, Kelly is an activist, an educator, and a leader inside the MAHA grassroots movement. One might even call her one of the OG, one of the original MAHA moms. Kelly, welcome to Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for this chat.
We want to get started by reading back to you something you posted on your social media recently, and this was specifically in relation to the liability shield for pesticide manufacturers. And you wrote, quote, "The leaders who repeatedly place pesticide manufacturer liability shields into congressional spending bills/farm bills deserve to be primaried. The Republicans who think that their constituents don't care about toxic exposures are very much mistaken." Look, MAHA has aligned itself with the Republican Party. You're, in some ways, it looks like you're kind of threatening Republicans ahead of the midterms. Tell us what you meant.
It has been such a long and frustrating fight around these liability shields. And the first liability shield was before Trump even came into office, where Bayer was trying to pass legislation through Congress, through the Farm Bill, so it's been going on for some time. So it's really it's sort of a post-partisan even issue, because you can always find, it's usually mostly Republicans, but you can find some Democrats that aren't willing to really go to bat on this issue, and it's sort of like a tradable thing. And that's something that I've really tried to raise over time. What is so frustrating right now with the MAHA movement is that, just to back up for a second, when I started social media and Glyphosate Girl and all that, I had primarily an audience of, I would say like coastal liberal people that are into organic food. And so that was, around 2018. So pre-COVID. So now about 7 years ago, when I was really actively starting to blog and come on the scene. And my readers were primarily people that were very focused on organic food, clean, and I'm certain mostly would align Democrat. And just, for the record, I actually am independent. I'm a registered independent. So I think I represent a lot of MAHA in that. Then around 2021, 2022, I noticed a huge shift in my Instagram following to be very conservative. And I was noticing that, Bible verses were showing up in people's bios. And so it was a real switch to what I was seeing. And I started talking to other people about this. I was like, oh my gosh, I think, conservatives are really starting to take this on. And there was a lot from the left that was thinking that was some kind of joke, like for real. And I was like, no, I really think that, and it's always seemed to me that this makes sense because of the attack that chemicals have on fertility, for example, on like your rights. And there are a lot of issues in there that I think are very, very conservative issues, actually. And so I was like, when are the conservatives going to realize that if you're going to fight for, say, pro-life, what about the fact that these pesticides are making us infertile? Because they are. Like, that's not hypothetical. They are making us infertile. And so when I saw this shift happening, I thought, oh my gosh, thank goodness. Now we are finally going to have a bipartisan situation where we can finally take care of pesticides, and the Republican Congress people are going to have to respond to this because this is what the constituents want. And I think we saw there's a lot of polling that the MAGA Republican constituents, by and large, are very aligned with MAHA ideals and with even on pesticides. So there's this misnomer and a misunderstanding on the part of our elected Republican officials. Most of them are older, that have been there for a long time, and they seem to think that Republican and pesticides are things that like defend one another. And that is certainly not the case when you actually go to the lower levels and talk to the constituents. And I think that lack of prioritization of human health is going to be the downfall of a lot of Republican candidates.
You talk about older Republicans in Congress, but then you've also got President Trump and Secretary Lee Zeldin. And they also seem to be very pro chemical company. They're going to be siding with Bayer in the Supreme Court case that's about to be heard. And I'm just wondering, as a MAHA mom, as somebody who supports Secretary Kennedy, who made this alliance with Trump, does this like sit a little heavy in your heart? How do you wrestle with that?
Oh my gosh, this has been so frustrating. And as most of your listeners know, Secretary Kennedy has no purview or responsibility whatsoever for the EPA. They are completely a different agency. There's nothing that Secretary Kennedy can do to manage the pesticide situation, which frankly, I think if he were in charge of the EPA, he would be running it very differently, because I know personally how he cares about pesticides and the environment. And 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 so when President Trump, this is what's interesting. So I actually, when the alliance happened with President Trump, I thought it was a very good thing. And I actually still think it's a very good thing, because this is so incredibly entrenched, this pesticide situation and chemicals in general, that it's going to take a leader that really does not care about the system to finally say enough. And I think that we've seen that over at HHS, where Secretary Kennedy's been, I mean, literally 2 years ago, I never would have dreamt that this kind of overhaul of our dietary guidelines could happen. And I was meeting at the FDA with the previous administration, with the head of human foods, who could not care less about the toxins and everything that's found, for example, in baby formula. It was so wild to sit there and realize, oh, you're not going to do anything. So the change that's happened at HHS and the FDA is insanely great. But I just am still holding out this piece of hope, because you're right. It feels heavy. This feels heavy. To watch the EPA completely get gutted under this administration is counter to actually things that President Trump has said, what we know Secretary Kennedy thinks, and actually to a certain extent, Secretary Rollins thinks. And so I'm still holding out hope that we have 3 more years. And the question is, can President Trump prioritize this enough that he says, hey, stop it? And what's interesting with Lee Zeldin is he's not an old guy. Like I think he's in his earlier mid 40s. He has kids, and he had leukemia. He had leukemia, which we know is so often traced to toxic exposures. And this was recent, like he had it just a couple of years ago. So when he first got into office, it was like, well, I don't know. This could be okay. Maybe it's not. I don't know. It seemed like it was a favor from President Trump, because Lee Zeldin was a huge defender of President Trump when he was in Congress. And so it made sense that this political appointment happened. But Lee Zeldin has no background whatsoever in environmental or chemical issues or farming or any of that. Like, that's just not his lane. So what happens is then he came, and whether it was his choice or not, I don't really know. But he stacked this with the most notorious chemical lobbyists I have ever seen. Like, if you could give awards to the best chemical lobbyists, they are now working for our EPA. And so and I've called this out repeatedly, and actually, and we can get into this meeting that I had actually with Lee Zeldin and the EPA, the lobbyists were not present. They didn't bring them, because I've been such a critic of those appointments.
Talk a little bit about that meeting, because it seems like you are pointing out publicly to your supporters, to MAHA supporters, this EPA is deregulating. This is going the wrong direction. So Zeldin brings you in, I think it was December, you meet with him. I mean, just honestly, like, do you feel like there's room to work with this administration and Zeldin and the EPA, or do you feel like they're just paying lip service to you? Do you feel like you're being gaslit by them? Like, what is going on there?
So this was interesting. So this petition went out, which I wrote, and was signed by a lot of really influential influencers in the MAHA movement. And so we were invited, or I went with 2 others to the EPA, and we had a meeting. We thought it was just me with Lee Zeldin. It ended up being with Lee Zeldin and probably 8 senior members of the EPA, not any of those chemical lobbyists that I'd been calling out, like Nancy Beck and Kyle Kunkel, who literally are now doing the things that they lobby for within the EPA now. And, it was very, I've been doing this for many years, and this is unprecedented, actually, to go and meet with the head of the EPA and meet all these people. They usually just have someone that's like public facing do these meetings, and it's not really very impactful. So this was really monumental, and it was a great discussion. And I felt like he took our concerns in consideration. I now am having regular meetings with the ag department at the EPA. And so those conversations certainly were happening. Now, one of the first things that Lee Zeldin asked was, are you going to say we need to ban pesticides? And I said, no, I'm not going to say ban pesticides like as a whole, but there's certain things that really we shouldn't be using here because, for example, they cause Parkinson's. But there's this misnomer that activists all think that tomorrow we could stop pesticide use in this country and everything would be fine. Whereas in truth, then our entire ag system would collapse. So that's not a viable path forward. So he was relieved to hear that that wasn't the approach that I thought was a smart one. So we had this meeting and subsequent meetings, and like personal cell phones, not of Lee Zeldin, but the others were given out. And when I have a question, they're very responsive and they want to get to the bottom of things. But this is where it's like, and this is where we're trying to suss out, when do these actual MAHA wins that Lee Zeldin is talking about begin? Because so far there have been a few things. And by the way, before this, he wasn't talking about any MAHA wins. I saw him nowhere in the discussion. You guys have probably seen Brooke Rollins and Bobby Kennedy frequently together doing things, for MAHA, and he was never part of the conversation. And so now that he's coming to the conversation, it's like, okay, this is great because we need more conversation, but what are the actual things going to be? And I think we're going to see over the next month whether or not he's actually able to put some of these things into practice that we've asked for. But so far, the MAHA wins have not been particularly winning because with phthalates, which are incredibly endocrine disrupting, there was this big MAHA win. But if you dug a little bit more deeply, it turned out they were just going to be regulated for very narrow purposes and not for the general population. And then with paraquat, there was this big MAHA win that they're going to move forward on regulating paraquat. But in reality, it's just calling for data from the manufacturers, which was court ordered to do. So it's not like that was some big win.
What about the Section 453 that it wasn't included in the funding bill about the liability shields? That was, I've listened to the MAHA action call. It's being called a big MAHA win. What do you think about that one?
So that actually is a big MAHA win. And that was separate from the EPA. So they didn't have anything to do with it. That was a straight up congressional bill. And what's happening is Bayer and the pesticide companies are using every possible pathway to try and get out of this cancer litigation. So they are doing it congressionally, federally, they're doing it at the state level, and they are doing it, through the Supreme Court, and to a certain extent also through the EPA, because the re-registration of glyphosate comes up this year. So 453 was this incredible movement and push on behalf of MAHA to convince, and actually it was bipartisan because you had Democrats coming in too, to try and make sure that that section did not make it into the final spending bill. And I have to tell you, we were very scared that it was going to. It was really close. It wasn't even supposed to make it as far as it did. And so what is going on behind these closed doors? So that was a huge relief. But unfortunately, they're bringing it back now for the next farm bill. And this is an example, G.T. Thompson. Why is he even still in office at this point if he is going to be prioritizing a liability shield?
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to the threat that, I think wisely, or you tell me, you're using the midterms and the fact that the Republicans may lose the House. So this is a very fraught moment politically. And you're saying we will primary you put your best foot forward in all these districts. We're going to take that person on, that Republican on, if they don't get behind saying no to this liability shield, language in a farm bill, for example. But what are the ramifications politically for that? I mean, we talked about MAHA and MAGA being a political union, which you said you still believe in. You think that was a positive still. If MAHA or your wing of MAHA is seen as the ones that hurt the Republicans in the midterms and the Republicans lost the House, are you willing to go that far for this issue? Is it that important to you? Are you worried about the blowback for MAHA? if
I
you do
am
that?
worried about that. And in my ideal situation, I would like to see Republicans who are aligned start standing up and being the ones to replace these people like GT Thompson who are not pro health. So my ideal situation is to get some people, whether they're more independent minded, but definitely health focused, into these seats. And, in order to protect Secretary Kennedy, I think we need to try and keep it Republican while he has his term there. And so that is also very, very
But it's
important
so
to me.
late, isn't it not? I mean, to get somebody on
It's
the
so
ballot,
late,
it's so late to do that now.
it's so late, and
Would you
you
vote for a
saw.
Democrat if you can't replace the Republican and the Republicans digging in and voting for immunity shield language? Would you vote for the Democrat? Would
If
you?
yes, if
Yes.
someone, if GT Thompson, for example, if this seems like this is the hill he dies on because he loves to brag about how he's going to give pesticide companies a liability shield. And to me, it's actually protective of Republicans to not vote him in.
Yeah.
And it's protective of all Americans. And I'm just fed up. And it's interesting how many people will say to me, this is the hill you're willing to die on, and on pesticides. But to me, it's so as I say, like it's a bipartisan thing. And I can't overstate enough how horribly screwed we are at this moment with how many chemical toxins are in our environment and our food. And we actually don't have capacity at this point to give a liability shield if we want to have continued fertility. And that sounds scary. It is 100% the case. One of the PFAS pesticides that Lee Zeldin just put into use is connected with shrinking testicles and decreased sperm motility, which we already have this huge problem with. And so and similarly with TSCA, which is something I know you guys have talked about with the Toxic Substance Control Act, them loosening the reins on that with specifically endocrine disruptors. And everyone wonders, well, why do we have this fertility crash? Elon Musk is always talking about, wow, we're really in problem. Look at this catastrophic fertility situation. And each time, like, I make a note and I'm like, it's the chemicals. And like, he never responds to that. But, and of course, he gets millions of tweets. But that is actually what is happening here. And once again, how can we make this louder within the Republican communities where the mega churches are talking about endocrine disruption and how it's messing with our hormones? I mean, this is like the moment for Republicans to grab onto this. So
That's really, and we should just mention that GT Thompson's a House member, a Republican from Pennsylvania. But I think a lot of people wonder, when we talk about rank and file MAGA, everyday MAHA, Republicans who are very energized on something like pesticides and herbicides. And you mentioned at the top two really interesting subjects that we think about, which are fertility and rights. So on rights, I think what you're saying is you have the right to breathe clean air and be healthy. And when pollution seeps into your lungs, your rights are infringed upon. So just help us understand the polling, like a poll that we picked up in the fall from Navigator that showed a lot of Republicans, vast majority of Republicans, believe that if a company is polluting, it should be regulated. There's a disconnect between that and what we're seeing at the EPA. Okay, we got that. But tell us about why this is such an important issue to everyday Republicans.
mm-hmm. And this is such an interesting just shift in time at this moment, because I think if you go back to, say, Reagan era with deregulation, let's prioritize corporate profits. That is our main thing: deregulate. And that was really became the mantra for a long time around the Republican Party. So if you are pro-business, deregulatory, you are a Republican. And something has happened just in, the last, I would say 10 years, where that is much less so the case. And so now you're seeing this general shift over to needing some type of regulation. So almost a step away from the libertarian kind of ideals that sometimes find themselves in the Republican Party to now, oh no, because we've seen the effects of what that does. And you're so right about the externality issue, right? Like, it's a basic economic concept where these externalities from pollution, they take their toll. And so something needs to be done to restrain that should not fall at odds with the Republican Party, particularly at this moment because of this sort of shifting feeling. And in the case of chemicals and actually of factory pollution, for example, a lot of the impact from that is actually in the red states. So I have family that is in North Carolina. My mother-in-law and father-in-law both died from pesticide exposure. They're in rural North Carolina. They grew up in tobacco field areas. They drink well water. Their entire little town has had horrible epidemics of brain tumors, cancer, neurological conditions. My father-in-law died of an ALS-like complication from pesticide exposure. So you have that. You have the whole area of Mississippi, like all these heavy industrial, very, very red areas of this country. And they're the ones that are dying and getting these horrible diseases, more so than you. I mean, of course, people in California, certainly the farm workers are frontline. But, and then you look through all the farming communities, and this should be very, very red state Republican. They should be screaming that this is terrible. And part of the reason why I think sometimes they are not is this assurance from the EPA and this trust that the EPA wouldn't allow these things to happen if they were actually detrimental to human health. Which brings me to this issue that also Lee Zeldin announced on Twitter, and maybe you guys saw it, where they are going to take away basically the cost benefit analysis on human health from air pollution. Okay, so I'm actually in the middle of discussions with them, so we'll see what they say.
Because this erodes every argument that it's too expensive. Like the companies are going to say it's super expensive, but now you can't calculate the premature deaths, and you can't calculate these things to justify the rule that's going to be expensive for the company, right? So this just means all this regulation seems, or is going to be, I guess, legally really onerous on the company without any real sense of what the benefit is, right?
Yeah, no sense of what the benefit is. And it is the oddest thing because the way that they do the economic analyses for valuing human health, it's not like it's some pie in the sky decision. This is so rooted in economic theory. It's been around for a long time. The gold standard application of benefits to human life from these regulations is not hard to calculate. And it's like this marginal impact. So you spend this much on like improving this, then what is the benefit to human health? And so to say that, and I think that the justification was we would like a different method, and I'm like, I don't know how much time Lee Zeldin or others have spent looking at different economic methods to calculate, but I can guarantee that it would have been better to lay on some sort of sensitivity analysis with what they're currently doing if it really was lackluster than to be gutting the whole thing. So anyway, as I say, but you know what? This is an example. So now I am in conversations with them because they're willing to talk to me about what their rationale was, but I haven't had that meeting yet.
But
so
you still, just to put a fine point on it, you still feel that there's room here to work with this EPA. Like, I think people listening may say,
"You're crazy.
You're crazy. This is so obvious. They're not going to change. Like, they're going further." But like, where do you come down on that?
So, and people listening probably will say she's crazy. This is the thing. I actually, and I could put a probability on it. I'm still holding it a pretty low probability, but I still have hope that there is going to be a day that President Trump understands this situation. I think that it is possible for him to understand the situation more at length if he, right now he's busy with Venezuela and around and everything. If he were to actually sit down, say, with people like me and and like my toxicologist friends, and learn what's actually happening to semen and to ovaries, and that testosterone levels are crashing because of these specific chemicals that are being released and now increasingly released, I think he would think that was gross. I mean,
right, like endocrine disruption is maybe the route to convincing.
That's the route.
Interesting.
That's the route. Because it's no lie, in politics aside, this is definitely decreasing testosterone and messing with estrogen in our population. I mean, there's no doubt that it is. And so for a party that seems very hyper-focused on gender identity and, sexual dysfunction or whatever it is, I would be very surprised if we come out the end of 4 years and nothing is addressed about it, because once again, there's no question this is what's happening. And it goes, and then, you have a lot of people that are very upset by that comment that, our hormones are being messed with and everything. But there are a lot of toxicologists that actually focus on these hormonal disruptions. And the reason why, and I've been to meetings with these toxicologists, it is so taboo to be discussing these scientific facts that our hormones are being disrupted, that a lot of scientists are unwilling to come forward and really make it their thing. Dr. Shauna Swan is someone who did, and she actually didn't get too much pushback. And it was just fascinating. So
well, it's interesting. And Kelly, you and I, full disclosure to our listeners, have talked about a lot of this stuff, just even personally. And, one of the things I'll say, of course, the question of gender has become so politicized in this country, and gender identity. But the truth is, when you even just look at things like puberty and the early onset of periods, I mean, I think I told you this, Kelly, that there was a young girl in my daughter's school who got her period at age 8, and it became a conversation amongst a lot of parents in the school that holy shit, girls are getting their periods at age 8. You don't actually have to go to the most fraught version of this conversation to feel like that can't be normal.
completely.
I want to move us to, so it was really interesting to me, Kelly, when you were talking about how in 2018, when you started a lot of this stuff, that your audience was primarily kind of coastal liberals, Democrats. I want to go to where you think, if you think the Democrats would have been a better partner in some ways, an easier partner, or do you think what I see a lot, particularly in the space of expertise and public health, is there appears to be still a lot of debate amongst experts on the hazards of a lot of these things that you are saying are hazardous to our health. And we know, Michael Grunwald wrote that article about how there's more danger in caffeine than there is in glyphosate. And I just want to read that one quote. That even that the Environmental Protection Agency, the European Food Safety Authority, regulators in Canada, Japan, Australia have all concluded glyphosate is safe for humans. Even the Center for Science and the Public Interest, which campaigns against unsafe chemicals, noted that glyphosate has, quote, significantly lower acute and chronic toxicity than many other herbicides on the market. And so what I want to ask is, on the one hand, it seems that you have a partner who's really cozy with industry, and that appears to be this EPA. And on the other hand, there appear to be potential partners who aren't convinced of the harms of a lot of these substances. So what do you do with that?
That is totally exactly my daily life. Is okay, wait, how do we move forward here? So first of all, on the glyphosate toxicity, it is actually true. That is not incorrect, that there are considerably more toxic herbicides out there than glyphosate. The issue is that glyphosate is used to such an excess that it really literally has pervaded our bodies, our environment. It is everywhere, and it's not harmless. And now if you dig into the Monsanto papers from the trial, you can see how cozy the relationship is and was between Monsanto at the time and the EPA. And certainly the influences that are there to make sure that glyphosate always gets this checkoff of oh, there's no concern for human health. What's interesting, that the biological evaluation that they also were mandated to do showed that it was something like 93% of endangered species would die, or get sick when exposed to glyphosate, but somehow humans, there's no effect to human health. So that's just a weird thing that's just sitting out there that a lot of people don't really focus on. But back to this, so I would say that this EPA is the worst EPA I've ever seen so far in terms of deregulation and not taking human health into consideration with these, literally now, and some of the things with the air pollution. But that also, by saying that, makes it sound like it's been great before, and it absolutely has not. It's been terrible and corrupt in every single administration, Democrat or Republican, has been ridiculous in protecting.
But to this level, you're saying that like
Well,
the
there are a lot
Biden
of things
EPA
like,
was not regulating? Like something we hear this a lot that like the system's so bad, it's been bad for decades. You can't expect change overnight. Stick with it. Like, is that what you're saying, or are you saying like it's just our whole system is so industry so entwined with the regulators at the EPA that like the bar is much lower. We have to lower the bar. What do you like? Just explain that point.
yeah, the EPA, for example, there's an endocrine disruption screening program that Congress mandated years ago, and they've just never done it. so, and so they say that they have, but for example, I went in and argued with the EPA Office of Pesticides under Biden about endocrine disruption and glyphosate and atrazine. And I brought this research, and it turned out that they had decided not to do an advanced screening of glyphosate because these studies that Bayer Monsanto has provided to them showed it's not an endocrine disruptor. So case closed. Okay. And so I'm sitting there with all this independent research saying, hey, that is not the case. Look at all this endocrine disruption that's coming from glyphosate. And it's dismissed. You're shown the door. You never hear from them again. And this just happens across the board. I mean, atrazine, we know it to be so endocrine disrupting. No, like that also didn't advance to another level. So I guess that my frustration, I mean, to me, even before this time, we were really screwed as a population already because they were unwilling to make any of these regulations that needed to happen yesterday. And truthfully, under Biden, I actually had hope that, for example, the phthalates, the PFAS, the paraquat, atrazine would be taken care of in those 4 years because it's something that could have happened. And it just didn't. They just dragged their feet. And now we're in the situation where, you know, it's even worse. But had those rules been put into place, it would have been so much better. So, and I actually wrote an article years ago about this because I just think that the entire EPA needs to have what has now happened in HHS, where corporate interests are just gutted. Like, I think it needs a gut renovation. It needs to just be that people that go and work there are actually working on behalf of people. The revolving door is shut. And you need a Kennedy-like figure to go over to the EPA to finally do something. But this has been very disappointing because my expectations going into this administration were that the EPA at the very worst would be status quo, not that it would be so significantly worse. So
I want to shift us to the Supreme Court case that's coming up. You know, as our listeners, when we told them up top, you know, and I'm just going to read some reporting on this, which is, so the Supreme Court has decided that it's going to hear this case about shielding Monsanto from liability over cancer claims. And the Trump administration is backing Monsanto in this particular case. And, you know, there are members of the MAHA movement who are not so happy. And I'm just wondering, Kelly, can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of this case and what you make of it currently?
oh my gosh. So this is the day that never should have come. Like this never should have come. And I was blogging from the very first glyphosate cancer trial in 2018. I did the first 3. I got a really good lay of the land, the arguments, how it all lays out. Glyphosate causes cancer. I mean, it's a contributor to cancer. And there are all of these scientists, all these studies that are saying that that's the case. And that is why Bayer stands to go bankrupt now, and their stock price crashed because there's enough evidence to show that this is what's happening. And you see Bayer come out a lot of times and they say, oh no, but you know, we actually are winning cases. We're winning some of the cancer cases. It's not true. But in reality, what they've done is quietly settled, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of these cases that they know they're going to lose in court because the evidence is that strong that particularly for people that have been using it as landscapers or whatever, that this is connected to cancer. And so the fact that, and in each of these cases, throughout all of the cases, Bayer's argument is always the EPA says that this is safe. It doesn't cause cancer. And that's what they say to juries. They say the EPA says it's safe. And so then the jury is left to wrestle with, do I trust the EPA or do I not trust the EPA? And then this data comes in that, oh, you really shouldn't trust the EPA. Look at how corrupt this is. And they base it on ghost written science and everything. And so then they lose the trial because the EPA is not this standard that really should be respected at this point. So it's not surprising that Bayer, in combination with the EPA, have now gone to push not only at the federal level, now with SCOTUS, the liability shield, but also at the state level. They're trying to do it at every angle to take away our rights to sue. And so there are a lot of people that say, okay, so let's say Bayer wins this case, and then the EPA label is the be all end all. No one can sue if the EPA says something is safe. There are plenty of people that would think that that's okay because we trust the EPA. So whatever the EPA said, it must be fact. And so we should trust that because those are great scientists. There are a lot of people that have this misconception that scientists sit at the EPA actually running the studies themselves, and they don't. They base their regulation on data that is provided by the very manufacturers that also are going to be selling the product. So there's no incentive to be truthful. So now, and the fact that the Solicitor General, the White House, told the Supreme Court to take it up blows my mind.
Yeah.
It blows my mind. And truthfully, at that moment, I wasn't sure if I could keep on MAHAing, with the exception that there are so many great things, as I say, that are happening over at HHS that I don't want that to stop. But that was.
But yeah, I think you're coming at the main question here, which is like, this is sort of a trial of MAHA against MAGA, if you really are looking at it, right? Like the Trump administration is siding with Monsanto on this. And boy, if there's one word that has come up in so many, you know, even before MAHA was MAHA, that grassroots movements have been trying to sort of ring the alarm on practices of Monsanto. Like that's gotta be tough, Kelly.
Oh, it's so tough. And at most MAHA rallies or events, glyphosate has come up. I mean, it's a hot topic for MAHA, and particularly with the pre-harvest desiccation, its impact on the microbiome. The functional doctors are testing for it. And so the thought that we're just going to be forced to accept it and have no recourse at all should be blowing the minds of everyone, actually, of the whole population. But it's very hard to get that information out when the opposition is so rich and powerful. And so I think that that's what was special about MAHA, is raising this alarm about it. But no, it was definitely like a huge slap in the face to MAHA when the White House did that, knowing how we all feel about it. And I don't think there's anyone in MAHA that is not concerned about liability shields in general, given what happened with the vaccines. It's the same thing, where then the manufacturer doesn't have any reason to be particularly responsible about what they're putting out there.
That's such a core theme of MAHA, which is accountability, corporate accountability, and exposing when government steps in and protects corporations over the health of people. But you said this was really, for you, like a moment where you thought, can I keep MAHA-ing? Like what would it take for you to say, I can't do this anymore. I can't be part of this alliance, and I need to forge out and find a different political avenue, home, direction? What would it take?
To me, I see, first of all, if Secretary Kennedy obviously was gone, then I would likely be out as well, because he's the one like doing all these impactful things right now. But what I really want out of this movement very badly is to emerge in a group that is growing and larger and becomes an even more substantial voting bloc for the next election and every election going forward, where both parties have to fight for this vote. And in order to do that, they're going to have to start saying no more to the corporate interests, or, because the Democrats definitely are better on pesticides, but, for example, not really in food toxicity a lot of the time. I worked on the White House convention on nutrition that they did, or it was like a celebration of nutrition a year ago. It was the White House Conference on Nutrition. And it was the 50 years since they had done.
Was this under Biden?
Under Biden. And so I contributed a lot of work about food toxicity, and the day came and all the toxicity part had been dropped. So they were only talking about food access by the time that day actually happened, not the sourcing, not the farming, not the pesticides, not the endocrine disruptors. And I was like, oh gosh, this is so disappointing. And we actually brought baby formula data to Amy Klobuchar, her office, thinking that she would be really concerned about the heavy metals that's in baby formula. But no, it's just dismissed repeatedly. And so I'm so post-partisan at this point where I'm just like, everyone needs to get on board and think that that is bad. Like that is very bad to have heavy metals and pesticides in baby formula. One thing that is concerning to me is I don't want this polarization to be so extreme where now Democrats are going to say, oh, that's a Republican issue. Pesticides and that fight and all of those things, all those pro-health things, like new dietary guidelines that actually make sense. Those are all Republican things, so we can't support it. We saw some Democratic senators are coming out wildly criticizing the new food guidelines, saying it's terrible, and lower income people should be allowed to keep on eating their ultra processed food. Like that's just not scientifically smart, and that's not the route that Democrats should be taking right now. Instead, they should be embracing these issues that have historically been Democratic issues, and not just be so reactionary, because it's going to hit them as well. You're going to lose voters at this moment. Democrats could decide they want to take back these issues. And there was actually a recommendation during a meeting I had with Cory Booker's office, not with Cory himself, but his staffers. And someone from MAHA said, why don't you, instead of just, criticizing the vaccine moms, let's say the quote anti-vax moms, the ones who have children that were vaccine injured, instead of belittling them and making them feel gaslit, why don't you instead have a conversation with them and say, tell me about that experience where, your child, in this, relatively rare case, had a vaccine and they screamed all night and they were never the same. What about that? Like, just be a sensitive human being around these things, and you will find that you will attract some of these people that are historically Democrats or left leaning. So it's a really important moment.
You've also identified a place with the EPA where Kennedy's hands are a bit tied at the moment. And it does leave an opening if you've got, President Trump being kind of cozy with a very pro-industry EPA, and Kennedy, whose hands are tied, that, if I'm a Democratic leader, that does leave an opening to sort of, own an issue when it comes to demanding more regulation of these companies at a time where, for the first time in our recent memory, Democrat and Republican voters are aligned in wanting to see chemical polluters held accountable. I mean, that's never happened in my lifetime. So this is a jump ball, is what I'm hearing you say.
Oh, totally. That's a perfect way to put it. It's a jump ball. And interestingly, since I started the petition, there have been some Democrat senators who are wanting to meet. So it's going to be interesting to see how that goes, because they're right. They should be sniffing this out and saying, oh, what is this? But then not give it lip service, but actually do the things and tell their colleagues to do the things that we want to see. So there's proof and not just more lip service, and so to me, MAHA, and whether it retains that name, I doubt it will, because I have tons of friends on both sides of the aisle that this is their number one thing. And so what is that block? And I think it's going to be so interesting to see over the next 10 years what that develops to be, because just of all these Gen Zers that are rallying around. I mean, I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal about how a lot of guys don't want to have anything synthetic in their boxers anymore. So it's like that kind of thing.
Like underwear, because of its endocrine disrupting property right next to their testicles. Right.
And so I'm like, great. Okay, can we get that kind of information going more and more where the public consciousness rises so much? And if nothing else, I think that MAHA has been great in doing that, because the pesticide liability shield issue in SCOTUS, I could not believe it. It made the front page of the New York Times a few weeks ago. And I'm like, what is going on? Like that never would have happened before. And only once in a while did you hear anything about pesticides in the New York Times. And so I'm like, oh, this is an interesting shift, right? Can this become a thing where even the New York Times is saying, you may be one of our advertisers, Bayer, but this is a really important thing to public interest?
Let me ask you, Kelly, what do you say to folks who are really worried about the impact on agriculture and farming and industry, and the sense that, MAHA, and this is what we hear a lot, that the healthy and wealthy MAHA moms are not, thinking about what this is going to do to your American farmer on the ground?
And that's what I do most of the time. It's my job. I co-founded the group American Regeneration, and we're highly focused on regenerative farming. So I agree that, and this goes back to what I said to Lee Zeldin, I'm not I'm not even I'm pro a glyphosate ban for pre-harvest desiccation. I'm not overall pro glyphosate ban because I think it would bankrupt our entire agricultural community. I mean, it would be a disaster because our entire GMO system is based on these chemicals at this point. So how do we back out of this nightmare that we're in that I think we accidentally got into? Where we're 100% seemingly, well, in a lot of the cases on a lot of farms, it is 100% dependency on chemicals. And I really liken it to how we are as a society also dependent on drugs. It's a similar thing. And in the same way, like if you are stuck on opioids, you're stuck on antidepressants, you're not going to be able to stop that. Tomorrow, you're going to have to wean off of it because otherwise you're going to have horrible physical symptoms of withdrawal. It's a similar thing for the soil. Where it's not ready to just stop and expect to still have yield. So farmers would be really in a jam if that were to happen, taking away the pesticides. So what we've been working on actually with the USDA, and we were thrilled to see a lot of our farmers that are our advisors were actually present at the big $700 million announcement with Brooke Rollins on investing in regenerative farming. And what is so cool, there are a lot of critics that have said, oh, well, that's nothing in comparison to what Biden did. And that wasn't that big of a deal, but actually it is a huge deal because first, it's just a 1-year pilot that hopefully will expand. Second, what makes this so notable, and this administration has been very serious about not just giving handouts, but rather needing to show outcomes. So in the case of this, the farmer, in order to continue to receive the grant money, has to prove that their soil health improved. So they do soil tests to show that the only way that can happen is if you're doing good practices, which lead to decreased chemical input. And I think this is where actually we ultimately will be able to overhaul the chemical system by enabling these farmers through these grant programs to become more profitable and independent and get off of the subsidies that truthfully, they don't even a lot of them don't like being dependent on the subsidies. A lot of them are suicidal. One of the things that we're working on is a roundtable that we're going to call Make Farming Profitable Again, where we can enable these large scale farmers to back off of the chemical inputs, restore health to the soil, but also to their entire community by decreasing. Not necessarily to go to organic. It's like, where are you? Can we meet you where you are and help you to get off of this train that's going just nowhere, basically?
It's such a massive undertaking, and there's obviously these really admirable steps to regenerative farming, things like that. But like, I imagine you'd have to change sort of the way we approach agriculture, the way we create food, the way we consume food, right? This would be a huge transition, right? I mean,
so huge. And it really, the one thing that is helpful is this now new attack on ultra processed foods, because of course, a lot of the ingredients that go into that are straight from the GMO system. So if you have less demand on that side, going to say, SNAP or school lunch programs, military, then you have less demand. And then that starts to change the economic pressure a little bit in terms of what you're producing. So while the dietary guidelines don't highlight any decrease in use of pesticides. And so I see these pictures, the vegetables and the fruit, and everything. And I'm looking at that. And actually, the truth is that there might be higher pesticide content now with the new dietary guidelines, because ultra processed food is so processed that a lot of times it actually isn't particularly chemical dense in terms of the pesticides. I mean, there are other chemicals that are added. But anyway, so I'm looking at that. But it also is going to change the demand now to be less off, to move off of the GMOs in the soy and the corn and into more whole foods, which ultimately will be easier to apply some regenerative agriculture practices around.
This is just something I'm curious about because I just don't hear it come up a lot. Does MAHA believe that climate change is real?
Oh my gosh, we don't really talk about climate change.
I know. I'm just wondering, where are we on that?
There are a lot of environmental groups that, I've been friends with for a long time because it overlaps, particularly with the soil stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're like, why aren't you guys talking about oil and, and all of these things? I'm like, we are just a human health focused group. I think that that's just where it is. And in my mind, I'm like, certainly from the soil and ecosystem standpoint that comes along with farming. And I work with a lot of people. In fact, Jonathan Lundgren is a scientist who's fabulous and one day should come on your show. He's so good. And he has been studying 1,800 farms. And he has proven that you can do regenerative practices at scale and become more profitable. And he documented every last thing about how you do it. And he literally is going in with a net and he captures what the insect population is at various times as these practices are put in. And you see like this explosion of diversity of not only plant, but also insects. And actually then sometimes they bring in like bird specialists. And they're like, oh, we haven't seen that bird here in like 20 years. And so it's this like biggest little farm beautiful thing that's happening at scale. And anyway, so ecosystem change comes into the conversation a lot through farming, but you really don't hear about the other parts unless you want to talk geoengineering, which then frustrates.
It's like it's not an issue that mobilizes MAHA. Like it's sort of like you got to go through the endocrine disruption rather than, I hate to say it, but cancer. Maybe endocrine disruption right now mobilizes more people because
cancer does not mobilize people. It's really interesting.
Right.
It's really interesting.
That's really wild.
And I do think that because so much of MAHA landed there because of their own, like in my case, autoimmunity, there are a lot of women with autoimmunity, but also, of course, their kids' food allergies. It is that, like, that's just the perspective is human health.
Let me ask a final question, Kelly. This has been so interesting. You had talked about, viewing Secretary Kennedy as this generational figure who's doing so much in this moment. What do you want to see him do in terms of the environmental space? You had started off by saying, and you're right, that he doesn't have jurisdiction over the EPA, but Lee Zeldin, along with Brooke Rollins, are part of MAHA. They're part of the MAHA Commission. The MAHA report that came out had their names on it. What do you want to see from Secretary Kennedy in this space?
So I had this really special moment with him in the courtroom back during the Monsanto trials. And he was really down one day. And he turned to me and he said, what are we going to do if we have no pollinators? And that overwhelmed him at that moment. And he was saying, this is just killing off all of our pollinators. All of these pesticides are just killing them off.
Like the bees? Like the bird?
Bees.
Bees. Okay, sorry.
Bees, butterflies, that whole business. So at his heart, talk about an environmentalist. I mean, that's really where his heart began, and with Rachel Carson and all that. And so I don't talk to him about this. There's nothing he can do. I presume there's nothing he can do because I know him to be very concerned about these issues. And I don't think it's something where he would draw the line unless he had to. And so my hope is he's a charismatic guy that people seem to like. Can he exert his influence over this other aspect in Lee Zeldin, just calling upon the human qualities inside that should, want to awaken someone like Lee Zeldin? Probably the lobbyists are a lost cause, but I do think that he has this incredible ability to influence. And so that would be my hope, is that he's able to do that, even if it's out of his jurisdiction, just to inspire that change, maybe be on a farm and point out, wow, we don't have pollinators. And because my sense was with Lee Zeldin that, as I said, he has no background in this area. Like it doesn't seem like he knows about it because it hasn't been his specialty. So can Lee Zeldin start talking with someone like Kennedy and meet some people from the Kennedy world and the MAHA world that are renowned on these things? I would love to see one day President Kennedy. So I'm still holding out hope that, because if we got that, oh my gosh, I know whoever was at the EPA would finally take care of these things in a rational, smart way and not screw our farmers over at the same time. So that's sort of my vision.
But in the meantime, you're saying behind the scenes, you'd like to see RFK, because if he does it publicly, is that tenable in this cabinet? Would he be pushed out of the cabinet? Would that?
I mean, I just don't know. The thing is, like, the first MAHA commission report did have glyphosate and atrazine listed in it. By the time the second one came, it was gone. And the Farm Bureau, I just was reading a Farm magazine, and like clearly the Farm Bureau went and met with President Trump, and suddenly it all changed. And that is the area where I think that he can influence, and he can influence President Trump, because I know he has the information that the Farm Bureau might not be quite right on that. So there's really, like, so much hope that sits with him, but he's also one man. And I just am really hoping that,
Right.
he's influenced so much.
And farmers
So-
have been so hurt,
Oh my God.
not only by
So hurt.
the policies, the tariffs, there's just been a lot that have just made a really rough situation even rougher. So right now, I imagine this administration would not see this as the moment to, challenge, a key tool that they use to bring, their crops to fruition.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And interestingly, a lot of the farmers I work with, there are a lot of younger farmers that are coming into the scene to take over the family farm, and they are really excited about regenerative practices. But over and over, I hear them say that my dad says we have to keep doing it this way. This is the only way to do it with the chemicals. So there's going to be a generational shift, I think, that is going to coincide with all these other things, which gives me a lot of hope. But you're right. You've seen Secretary Rollins do these huge outlays of more subsidies and subsidizing the same old broken system. And I think that it's just something that they're not able to take on right now because of the farming crisis.
Kelly Ryerson, so good to have you on the show. We really sure do hope you come back, particularly when the SCOTUS trial is up and running. But Kelly Ryerson, educator, activist, very influential voice inside the MAHA grassroots movement. Thank you so much for joining us on Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you for having me.
So that was our episode today. As Tom said up top, please do send us questions and comments at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. Leave us a rate, review. I am Brenda Arcari. He is Tom Johnson. Mark and Maggie will be back with us on the next episode, and we'll see you on Thursday.